Welcome back, kids. I hope you enjoyed my first Global Regions review, and I hope you found it interactive and helpful. But this is the Global Regions review part 2. It's going to cover both global history and geography, because as we know, geography is a huge part of it, and it will be more comprehensive than my first one, and hopefully a little bit more interactive. Good luck. The Byzantine Empire, 330 to 1453. This is a very important topic, kids, because it always shows up on the regions, and we want to pass the regions, right? So, as you can see on this map, it was located in southern Europe, and large portions of it were located in what's now known as modern-day Turkey. In fact, their capital, Constantinople, is located in what's now known as Istanbul in modern-day Turkey. And it wasn't just Turkey. I mean, if you look at this map, you would see that it was also located in modern-day Greece, as well as parts of southern Italy. And it's a very important topic, and we have to know it for the regions, because you guys want to pass. Emperor Constantine. In the year 330, Emperor Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor, moved the Roman capital from Rome to Byzantium, modern-day Turkey. Western Roman Empire was weakening and eventually collapsed in the 5th century. The Byzantine Empire set up its own branch of Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which was separate from the Roman Catholic Church. What were the main differences? Well, at first, Orthodox Christianity was not loyal to the Pope. They had their own patriarchs, and their language was Greek and not Latin. Byzantine culture and influence. Well, kids, their culture was a blend of Greek, Roman, Middle Eastern, and Christian cultures. Their capital, Constantinople, which was located in modern-day Istanbul and Turkey, was a major trading city and received spices and silk from Asia, wines, olives, and grains from within the empire itself, because if you looked at the map, the empire was very large, and first from Russia, which was back then was known as Rus, and it actually influenced Russia in lots of ways, because Russia adopted Orthodox Christianity and their strong central system of government. Feudalism in Europe. Well, before we discuss feudalism, we have to define it. Well, what is feudalism? It was a political system in medieval Europe which ran from 1450 to 1500, which occurred after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the year 450. Well, this system usually had the king on top, or the pope above the king. I mean, depending on the country. If it was a Catholic country, the Catholic king was technically below the pope, but usually it was the king, nobles, knights. Below knights, you usually had traders and craftsmen, peasants, and serfs on the very bottom. It varied a bit by region, but for the most part, this is how it went. In feudal system, the lord had an obligation to offer peasants protection in exchange for their services. If those peasants were serfs, they were forever tied to lord's land and were almost like slaves. The only difference was that slaves could be bought and sold individually, but serfs could only be sold with the land they were on. So for instance, let's say there was a rich lord who wanted to get a large number of slaves, the serfs, who were like slaves. But how would they get them? Well, the only way to get them would be to buy the land that they were on. They couldn't by them individually. So serfs could forever, they were forever tied to their land. And vassals, servants of the Lord, could be called by the Lord to serve in his military, once again in exchange for protection. The Middle Ages, very important topic, always shows up on the Regents in one way or another. Wow, it ran from 450 to 1500. And this period in history was also known as the Dark Ages. Why? So why sometimes you see this period known, being called medieval times, Middle Ages, and in this case the Dark Ages. Why the Dark Ages? Well, simply because there was a decline in trade and learning, and increase in ignorance and fear of the outside world. So, without much learning, there was simply no way for many Europeans to gain knowledge of the outside world, and without education, which is usually known as light, there was darkness. And actually the only way, one of few ways that you could get an education in Europe at the time is to go to what was known as monastic schools and become a monk, because monks were educated because they had to learn how to read the Bible. So monastic schools at the time were very, very important because they were one of the few sources of education during the Middle Ages. Crusades, 1095 to 1291. Very important topic, always shows up in the Regents. So what were the Crusades? Well, there were a series of religious wars waged by European knights and kings, Catholic kings and Catholic knights, to recapture the Holy Land, which was the Jerusalem. Why? Well, Jerusalem is a holy place to Christians because that's where Jesus was believed to have been crucified and went to heaven. Christians also wanted to ensure safe passage to Jerusalem by Christian pilgrims. The problem was that Jerusalem was at the time controlled by Muslims, followers of Islam. It is considered to be the third holiest city in Islam because according to Islam, that's where Prophet Muhammad went to heaven. So both sides had religious reasons for the control of that land and were highly motivated. Well, the First Crusade. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade to recapture the Holy Land. Church offered salvation, forgiveness of all sins for those who went to war in the Holy Land. Christian kings and knights were highly motivated because they believed that Jesus would help them recapture the Holy Land. The First Crusade was successful because Christians did in fact capture the Holy Land and were able to drive the Muslims out. But that control lasted from 1099 to 1187. That's when Muslims finally kicked the Christians out of Jerusalem. Later Crusades. The Second Crusade in 1147 was only partially successful because Christians could not recapture all of that land, and Muslims eventually drove Christians out. There were 7 crusades, and one of the most interesting crusades was the Children's Crusade. That's where kids were sent into the Holy Land. Well, the belief was that since they were children, they didn't have any sense, God would lead them to victory. Well, what happened was that most of those kids were sold into slavery, and some died on their journey to the sea, and none made it to the Holy Land. Alright kids, let's sum it up. Positive and negative impacts of Crusades. Positive impact. Well, increase in trade between Europe and Asia and improved European contact with the outside world. Negative impact. Increased religious tensions between Christians and Muslims, as well as the Jews, who were often targets of crusaders in Europe. Well, kings gained more rights to tax their people, and impact from crusades is still alive in the world today. So, for example, many modern terrorists in the Middle East use jihad, which is known as the holy war to them, to justify their action. Many of them call Westerners crusaders. In many ways, it could be argued that jihad is a modern version of crusades, because it is a religious war, and that's what was known about crusades. Japan, that's our next topic. And it always shows up in the Regents in one way or another, so you kids gotta know it. So first, let's just discuss Japan's geography. Japan is an archipelago. What, you might ask? What the hell is an archipelago? Well, it's a group of islands. Japan is not just one island, it's a group of small islands. Japan has many mountains and has few natural resources, which historically influenced it to look for those resources elsewhere. We will discuss it in more detail when we deal with the Meiji Restoration, but for now, that's the basic information you need to know about Japan's geography. Japanese feudalism. Europe was not the only place in the world that had feudalism, because Japan had it too. Japan was an imperial system with an emperor, but by the year 800, nobility started to gain more political power. This caused emperor to become a mere symbolic figure. By the year 1100, Japan was controlled by military warlords. Japanese feudalism had a shogun, who was a governor-general on top, followed by daimyo, who were lords who were loyal to the shogun, samurai, warriors who swore allegiance to either shogun or daimyo. They followed Bushido code of conduct. Bushido stated that they should exemplify simplicity, honor, courage, and obedience. You guys have to remember Bushido because it always shows up in the Regents in one way or another. It's always going to show up on the Regents, so you gotta know Bushido code of conduct. I've seen it show up multiple times. It's a very simple question, and oftentimes students get it wrong because they haven't studied it. And getting back to the Japanese feudalism, artisans, peasants, and lastly merchants constituted the rest of the Japanese feudal system. Interestingly enough, merchants were on the bottom of the Japanese feudal system, although they were wealthy. They could have gotten considerable amount of wealth, which was quite different from what you would find in Europe, where usually on the bottom of the social structure had the poorest of the poor, peasants and serfs. Okay kids, now we're going to discuss the Japanese culture. Early Japan, so we're talking about 6th through 9th century, adopted many aspects of a more advanced Chinese civilization. It adapted Buddhism from China, Confucianism, art, literature, and the system of writing. The system of government, in terms of establishing a centralized government with civil service exams, was also adopted from China. Welcome back kids! We're going to discuss the Mongols now. The Mongols were one of the greatest conquerors in human history. And it wasn't just their military victories, it was their political achievements that had a lot of impact on global history. The Mongol Empire, which lasted from approximately 1216 through 1400. It was the largest empire in history. It was had more land area than even the Hellenistic Empire of Alexander the Great, which we discussed in my first video. And the Mongol Empire was larger than Alexander the Great's empire, and it stretched across Asia and went as far as Eastern Europe. So if you look at this map, you could just see the area, the vast area that it covered. Keep in mind that in ancient time, before telephones, before modern communication, it was remarkable how Mongols were able to manage that empire. Truly a remarkable feat of human achievement. The Mongol method of government. Well, Mongols conquered people and they forced them to pay tribute to them. But the thing is, the conquered people were allowed to maintain their culture, religion, and lifestyle. Now, why would Mongols allow them to maintain their culture, religion, and lifestyle? Well, they did it so that they could reduce the chance of rebellion. So, if people had the chance to maintain their culture, they wouldn't have as much of an incentive to rebel. And the greatest leader was Genghis Khan. But the thing about Mongols is they encouraged intermarriage between Mongols and conquered people. Why? The reason for that was to make Mongols seem less like outsiders. And they actually influenced Russia, which back then was called Rus, to adopt Mongols' harsh system of government. And Russian czars used Mongols' brutal system of government from 1440 through 1917, which was the year of the Russian Revolution, when communists overthrew Tsar Nicholas II and took power in Russia. But yeah, truly remarkable achievement. Mongol Decline. So why would the Mongol Empire suddenly decline? Well, the decline wasn't sudden, but basically after the death of Genghis Khan, it started to split into separate parts, and each of them had their own ruler. So there was sort of a struggle for power, but it wasn't that the empire declined suddenly. They actually had some strong rulers after Genghis Khan. For example, Batu Khan, who was his grandson, conquered Russia, or Rus. So Mongols still had power after his death, but there was definitely some sort of struggle for power, and without one strong ruler, eventually as the time went on, Mongols began to fight each other, and this further weakened their Mongol Empire. And even though Genghis Khan died in 1227, Mongol Empire survived until the 1400s. So it wasn't a sudden decline. It was a gradual decline. Our next topic is called the Black Death, also known as bubonic plague. It was a disease in Europe which started on approximately the year was 1347 and ran through approximately 1353. As you can see from this map, it devastated large parts of Europe and completely changed the makeup of European population. It was a devastating disease, and back then people of Europe had no idea how to treat it. The Black Death, it's theorized that it originated in Asia and spread to Europe by trading ships. The disease was spread by flies on the back of rats. Its original point in Europe was believed to be southern Italian peninsula. Europe had poor sanitation, which contributed to large amounts of garbage. which brought in more rats and fleas and further spread the plague. As farmers died, it led to shortages of food, which contributed to more European victims. So now, as you can see, Europeans were not just dying from the bubonic plague. Many Europeans were dying from famine. There was no food. And there was very little food. And approximately a third of the European population died. And some estimates put the number as high as one half. So you can just imagine the devastation that Europe faced. The Renaissance, 1500 through 1700. So what was the Renaissance? Literally means rebirth. It was a revival of learning in Europe after the Middle Ages. There was an interest in ancient Greek and Roman culture, as well as the development of contemporary culture, which promoted learning. So when you see Renaissance, think rebirth. Art played a huge part in the Renaissance, as well as literature. So let's discuss briefly, two writers who might show up, on your Regents. Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince. His basic philosophy was it's better to be feared than loved. Rulers should do everything they can to keep power. That means kill, lie, cheat. That was his philosophy. That was Machiavelli's philosophy. Erasmus, in The Praise of Folly, he criticized scholars, clergy, and philosophers for being too narrow-minded. Renaissance! Its basic philosophy revolved around humanism. So what the hell is a humanism? It was a belief that all people are special and should seek happiness on earth rather than just heaven. Galileo was an Italian astronomer who in 1609 published a book where he stated support for heliocentric model, which stated that Earth revolved around the Sun, as opposed to geocentric model, which was supported by the Catholic Church, and which stated that the Sun actually revolves around the Earth. So when you see the Sun going up in the morning, that means the Sun is moving. That's what the Church believed. And these teachings were contradictory to the teachings of the Catholic Church, which imprisoned him. The Church also banned Catholics from reading books about science.